trade dependency between Mexico and the United States is one of the most underestimated yet most powerful forces shaping the political and economic relationship between these two nations. For decades, their economies have been tied together in a way that makes separation impossible, but balance elusive.
The United States depends on Mexico for far more than most Americans realize, while Mexico depends on the United States in ways that make it both vulnerable and resentful. What we are witnessing today is the unraveling of an arrangement that was profitable for corporations on both sides of the border, but painful for millions of working people.
When we talk about trade dependency, we are not simply talking about numbers on a balance sheet. We are talking about jobs, wages, prices in the supermarket, and the dignity of work itself. The North American Free Trade Agreement and its successor, the USMCA, institutionalized this dependency.
U.S. corporations moved factories to Mexico to take advantage of cheaper labor, weaker unions, and looser regulations.
This wasn't free trade, it was a managed system designed to protect profits by exploiting the wage gap between American and Mexican workers.
Companies could cut costs, boost shareholder returns, and flood the U.S. market with goods produced under conditions they would never accept at home.
For Mexico, this meant jobs, yes, but jobs that often paid poverty wages, jobs that kept families alive but did not lift them into stability.
This was dependency built on inequality.
On the other hand, the United States became reliant on Mexican imports, not only for manufactured goods like automobiles, electronics, and machinery, but also for agricultural products that stocked
American supermarkets. Mexico supplies the United States with fruits, vegetables, beer, and meat on a massive scale. Strip away those imports, and prices would skyrocket, shelves would empty, and the illusion of self-sufficiency in the United States would collapse overnight. Dependency, then, is not one-sided, it is mutual, but mutual does not mean equal. The United States has historically dictated the terms, and Mexico has often been forced to adapt.
That imbalance is now being challenged. Workers on both sides of the border feel the sting of this dependency.
In the United States, the relocation of industries to Mexico hollowed out entire towns, especially in the Midwest.
Factories that once sustained middle-class communities were shut down, jobs shipped south, and local economies devastated.
Politicians told Americans this was the price of globalization, that cheaper goods would make up for lost jobs.
But what good is a cheaper car if you no longer have a paycheck to buy one? On the Mexican side, workers were told that foreign investment would lift them into prosperity.
Instead, they found themselves locked into low-wage cycles, with corporations extracting wealth while offering little in the way of security or upward mobility.
Dependency once again meant vulnerability. The imbalance is not only economic, it is political. Trade dependency gives leverage. The United States has often used the threat of tariffs, sanctions, or renegotiations to bend Mexico to its will, whether on labor, migration, or security issues. When former U.S. administrations demanded that Mexico act as a buffer to stop migrants heading north, they tied that demand to trade concessions.
This is not partnership. It is pressure disguised as diplomacy. Yet, what is changing now is that Mexico is beginning to assert its own leverage. As global markets shift, Mexico is diversifying its trade relations, strengthening ties with China, Europe, and other Latin American countries.
This weakens the U.S. monopoly and signals that dependency might one day run in the other direction. The pandemic revealed just how fragile this dependency really is. When supply chains collapsed, Americans discovered how much their daily lives relied on goods from across the southern border.
From car parts to medical equipment, disruptions in Mexico meant shortages in the United States.
For decades, this dependency was invisible, hidden behind smooth logistics and corporate profit margins.
But when crises hit, the truth became undeniable. The economies of these two nations are so intertwined that shocks in one reverberate instantly in the other.
The deeper question is whether this trade dependency can ever become something more balanced and just.
Right now, it is structured to benefit elites. Corporations design the agreements, reap the profits, and lobby governments to maintain the status quo.
Workers, whether in Detroit or Monterrey, have little say. They are told to compete against each other in a race to the bottom.
If wages rise in Mexico, jobs threaten to leave again, perhaps to Asia. If wages stagnate in the United States, workers are told to blame immigrants or foreign competitors.
This is how dependency is weaponized, not to unite workers, but to divide them, to pit them against each other while the same corporations exploit them both.
Something big is indeed building between Mexico and the U.S., and trade dependency is at the core of it.
When inequalities stretch too far, when one nation refuses to remain in a subordinate role, change becomes inevitable.
The risk is that political elites will turn that change into conflict, tariff wars, migration crackdowns, nationalist rhetoric.
But there is also an opportunity to redefine dependency as interdependence, where mutual reliance is recognized and structured in a way that benefits ordinary people, not just the top 1%.
Coming clash over trade is not only about economics. It is about who holds power, who sets the rules, and whose interests will shape the future of North America. Migration pressures between
Mexico and the United States are not simply about people crossing a border. They are about the failures of two economic systems that cannot meet the needs of their own people.
Migration is painted in the media as a crisis of individuals seeking opportunities, but in reality, it is the predictable outcome of structural inequalities, corporate greed, and political neglect.
For decades, millions of Mexicans have crossed into the United States, not because they wanted to leave their homes, but because economic policies made it impossible for them to stay.
The United States, meanwhile, has depended on this flow of labor while simultaneously demonizing it, using migrants as both a source of cheap work and a convenient scapegoat for broader economic
Failures, migration pressures are, in truth, the pressure valve of a system that refuses to fix its internal contradictions.
Let us begin with the root causes. In Mexico, migration is often driven by poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity.
Trade agreements like NAFTA promised to modernize Mexico's economy, but in practice they devastated traditional agriculture.
Small farmers unable to compete with heavily subsidized U.S. agribusiness were driven off their land.
Entire communities lost their livelihoods, forcing people to seek work elsewhere, most often across the border.
That was not an accident. It was the intended design of an economic system that sacrificed rural stability in Mexico to secure cheap labor for U.S.
industries. Migration, therefore, was not the failure of NAFTA. It was its predictable consequence.
In the United States, migrants filled the jobs that corporations needed: farm work, construction, food processing, and low-wage service jobs.
Employers welcomed them because migrants could be paid less, worked longer hours, and were more vulnerable to exploitation.
Laws made them precarious, and that precarity was profitable. The U.S. economy in many ways became dependent on this influx of Mexican labor. Crops were harvested, houses were built, and factories were staffed thanks to migrants who had little power to demand fair wages or protections.
The truth is that migration pressures were never a burden for U.S. corporations. They were a gift, And yet, politically, migration became a weapon.
Leaders in Washington used it to stir fear and division, framing migrants as a threat rather than a resource.
When jobs disappeared in the Rust Belt because factories were relocated to Mexico or Asia, workers were told to blame immigrants, not the corporations that abandoned them.
When wages stagnated, people were told that migrants were undercutting them, not that employers were exploiting both groups alike.
Migration pressures were turned into a narrative of us versus them,
fueling xenophobia while distracting from the real culprits. An economic system that sacrifices workers on both sides of the border for the sake of profit. Mexico, too, has used migration as a bargaining chip. Successive governments have quietly relied on migration to the United States as a safety valve for social unrest.
When jobs were scarce and inequality grew intolerable, migration provided an escape.
Remittances, money sent home by migrants working in the U.S., became one of Mexico's largest sources of foreign income, stabilizing the economy. In this sense, migration functioned as a subsidy for Mexico's political class. Instead of fixing structural inequality, they allowed people to leave and send money back. At the same time, U.S. administrations pressured Mexico to act as an enforcer, stopping Central American migrants from crossing through Mexico to the U.S.
border. Once again, migration was manipulated as a tool of policy, not treated as the human reality it truly is. But migration pressures cannot be contained forever. Walls, militarized borders, and detention centers do not address the reasons people migrate. They only criminalize them after the fact.
As long as wages are depressed in Mexico, as long as rural communities cannot compete with U.S. agribusiness, as long as inequality pushes families into desperation, people will keep moving north.
And as long as the U.S. economy relies on cheap, vulnerable labor, corporations will find ways to attract and exploit migrants regardless of political slogans.
Migration pressures are not a temporary phenomenon. They are built into the very structure of the U.S.-Mexico relationship.
The pandemic exposed this dependence with brutal clarity. While politicians raged about securing the border, migrant workers were declared essential.
To keep food supplies moving and industries running, they were needed to harvest crops, process meat, and sustain logistics networks at the very moment when health risks were highest.
Migrants worked through danger, often without adequate protections, while public rhetoric continued to demonize them.
It was a moment of hypocrisy that revealed the truth. The U.S. cannot function without migrant labor, no matter how loudly politicians pretend otherwise.
Looking forward, migration pressures are set to intensify. Climate change threatens to displace more people from Mexico and Central America, as droughts, storms, and environmental collapse make agriculture even harder.
Automation and global competition may continue to displace workers, deepening desperation in both nations.
These forces will not respect borders. They will push people across them.
And unless the structural roots of migration are addressed, unequal trade, corporate exploitation, and political neglect, the cycle will only worsen.
The choice before both nations is clear. Migration can continue to be weaponized, used to divide people, to enforce inequality, to maintain a system where elites profit while workers suffer.
Or it can be reimagined, not as a crisis, but as a reality of shared humanity. That would mean fairer trade policies, stronger protections for workers, and recognition that both economies depend on one another, not just for goods and services, but for people themselves.
Migration pressures, after all, are not about strangers at the border.
They are about neighbors, workers, and families caught in a system that treats them as disposable.
What happens next will depend on whether leaders choose fear and division or solidarity and justice. Security and crime form one of the most complex and volatile aspects of the relationship between
Mexico and the United States, for decades, both governments have declared wars
Against drugs, gangs, and organized crime, yet the results speak for themselves. Violence persists, drug markets thrive, and the border remains a conduit not only for narcotics but for weapons.
money and corruption. To call this a shared problem is true, but incomplete.
The reality is that security and crime are deeply intertwined with the very structure of U.S. Mexico relations, shaped by demand on one side, supply on the other, and policies that have consistently
Failed to address the underlying causes. What we are left with is a system that perpetuates violence while benefiting certain interests that profit from instability.
The so-called war on drugs is the most visible expression of this shared struggle on the U.S.
side. Demand for narcotics, from marijuana and cocaine to methamphetamines and fentanyl, creates a massive market.
That demand drives production and trafficking networks in Mexico.
For every speech about cracking down on crime, there is a consumer base in the United States whose appetite funds cartels to the tune of billions of dollars.
To pretend that this is solely Mexico's problem is a convenient political fiction. Without U.S. demand, Mexican cartels would not exist at the scale they do.
But supply flows both ways. If drugs travel north, guns travel south. The United States is the largest source of firearms for Mexican criminal organizations.
Lax gun laws and weak enforcement mean weapons are purchased legally in U.S. border states and smuggled across to Mexico, where they arm cartels and fuel violence.
The so-called security crisis in Mexico cannot be separated from the steady flow of U.S. weapons that make organized crime so deadly.
The hypocrisy is staggering. American politicians decry the violence in Mexico while defending the very gun laws that export that violence.
Corruption adds another layer of complexity. Cartels do not operate in a vacuum. They rely on networks of protection within politics, law enforcement, and business.
In Mexico, corruption is often visible and brutal, with officials caught colluding with traffickers or turning a blind eye.
But in the United States, it is subtler financial institutions that launder cartel money, politicians who grant, and about crime while quietly avoiding reforms, or private companies that profit from
militarization and security contracts. Both sides benefit from maintaining the illusion of progress, while the deeper system remains untouched.
The human cost is devastating. Mexico has endured tens of thousands of deaths in cartel-related violence, with entire regions caught in cycles of fear and instability.
Families are displaced, communities fractured, and trust in institutions eroded.
In the United States, the opioid crisis kills tens of thousands every year, destroying communities from rural towns to urban neighborhoods.
These are not separate tragedies. They are connected by the same pipeline of drugs, money, and weapons that flows across the border.
Security and crime, then, are not national problems. They are binational consequences of a shared failure. Both governments have responded primarily through militarization. Mexico has deployed its army to fight cartels, often with disastrous results.
Violence escalates as cartels splinter, compete, and retaliate, dragging civilians into the conflict.
The United States has poured billions into security, assistance, training, and surveillance technology, yet the flow of drugs has not slowed. In fact, Cartels have become more sophisticated, diversifying into human trafficking, fuel theft, and even parallel governance in some areas.
Militarization has not solved the problem, it has institutionalized it. One must also ask who benefits from this endless cycle.
For arms manufacturers, private security contractors, and certain political figures, the continuation of violence is profitable.
For corporations that thrive on instability and cheap, vulnerable labor, the chaos south of the border serves as a useful backdrop.
For politicians, crime becomes a campaign tool. They can point to the threat from across the border to justify stronger borders, more policing, and more fear.
Security and crime, in this sense, are not only problems, they are assets in the hands of those who know how to exploit them.
And yet the alternative is rarely discussed. What if instead of pouring money into militarization, both nations invested in addressing root causes?
In Mexico, that would mean strengthening rural economies, creating real opportunities for youth, and building institutions that can resist corruption.
In the United States, it would mean tackling demand through healthcare, addiction treatment, and education, while reforming gun laws to stop the southward flow of weapons.
But such solutions threaten powerful interests, so they are ignored. The pressure is building, however.
Cartel violence is no longer confined to remote areas. It has reached tourist hubs, urban centers, and even political campaigns.
In the United States, fentanyl overdoses are now a leading cause of death for young adults, making the crisis impossible to dismiss.
Something big is indeed coming between Mexico and the U.S., and the security-crime nexus is a central fault line.
If both sides continue down the path of militarization and scapegoating, the violence will escalate and the costs will rise.
But if they confront the structural causes, economic inequality, corporate exploitation, weak governance, and the hypocrisy of demand and supply, they might finally break the cycle.
Security and crime are not accidents of geography. They are products of policy and profit.
Until that is acknowledged, both nations will remain trapped in a dance of violence, pretending to fight while quietly enabling the very system they claim to oppose.
The real question is not whether something big will happen, but whether it will be another chapter of fear and death, or a turning point toward honesty and justice.